On the morning of May 1st, 1960, an American pilot climbed into a sleek black aircraft at a secret base in Pakistan. His name was Francis Gary Powers. His mission: fly 3,000 miles across the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet, photograph military installations, and land safely in Norway. He had done it before. The aircraft he was flying, the Lockheed U-2, had been doing it for 4 years, flying so high that the Soviets could track it on radar, but couldn't reach it. That morning, something went wrong. Powers never made it to Norway. What happened next triggered one of the most serious diplomatic crises of the Cold War, humiliated the President of the United States on the world stage, derailed a peace summit between the two most powerful nations on Earth, and dramatically increased tensions between the world's nuclear superpowers. And it all began with a spy plane that the United States government swore didn't exist. This is the full story of a U-2.
Another world, sky.
To understand why the U-2 was built, you have to understand the terror of the early 1950s. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. 4 years later, in 1953, they tested a hydrogen bomb, a weapon hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The United States was now facing an adversary with nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. And the Americans knew almost nothing about what the Soviets were building. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet military was operating in near total secrecy. How many bombers did they have? Where were the missile sites? How many nuclear warheads had they produced? Were they preparing for a first strike? American intelligence had almost no answers. Traditional spy methods, agents on the ground, intercepted communications, were producing fragments, not pictures. And pictures were what the military needed. Hard, irrefutable photographic evidence of what the Soviets were building and where. In 1952, President Eisenhower authorized a top-secret study to find a solution. The conclusion was radical: build an aircraft that could fly so high, so far, and so fast that the Soviets would be powerless to stop it. An aircraft that could fly directly over Soviet territory, photograph everything below, and return safely to friendly airspace. The project was given to the CIA, and the CIA gave it to a man named Kelly Johnson. Before we continue our story, let's take a closer look at the aircraft that made all of this possible. The U-2 Dragon Lady, built in secret by Lockheed's Skunk works. Its role: strategic reconnaissance, or in plain terms, spying from the edge of space. Top speed: 805 kilometers per hour. That's 500 miles per hour. Not fast by fighter jet standards, but speed was never the point. Service ceiling: 70,000 feet. That's over 13 miles above the Earth's surface. So high that the sky above the cockpit turns black, and the curvature of the planet becomes visible to the naked eye. Range: 3,975 miles on a single mission. Enough to cross the entire Soviet Union without stopping. Power: 1 Pratt & Whitney J57 engine. A single engine carrying a single pilot to the edge of the atmosphere, where one wrong move meant death. Maximum takeoff weight: 37,500 pounds. Remarkably light for an aircraft with a 103-foot wingspan. In service: 1955 to the present day. 70 years of flying. Still operational. Still classified. Built to see what others can't. Flying high. Staying ahead. Now, let's get back to our story. Kelly Johnson was already a legend in American aviation. His Skunk Works division at Lockheed had produced some of the most advanced aircraft of World War II. He was known for doing the impossible, quickly, cheaply, and in absolute secrecy. The requirements for the new aircraft were extraordinary. It had to reach altitudes above 70,000 feet, higher than any Soviet fighter or surface-to-air missile of the era could reach. It had to have a range of at least 4,000 miles to cross the Soviet Union without refueling. and it had to carry cameras powerful enough to photograph objects on the ground from 13 miles up. Johnson's solution was elegant and strange. He designed an aircraft that was essentially a powered glider. The U-2 had an enormous wingspan, 103 feet, far wider than its fuselage was long. The wings were long and thin, like a sailplane's, designed to generate maximum lift in the thin air at extreme altitude. The fuselage was narrow, almost skeletal. The entire aircraft weighed as little as possible. A single Pratt & Whitney J57 engine, the same engine used in the B-52 bomber but extensively modified, would power it to altitude. The engineering challenges were immense. At 70,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that the difference between the aircraft's maximum speed and its stall speed, the speed below which it falls out of the sky, is less than 10 miles per hour. Pilots called this the coffin corner. Too fast, and the aircraft breaks apart. Too slow, and it stalls and falls. The margin for error was almost non-existent. The pilot had to wear a full-pressure suit, similar to a spacesuit, because at that altitude, an unpressurized human body would be dead within seconds. And the cameras. The U-2's cameras were a technological marvel. A system called the B camera, developed specifically for the program, could photograph a strip of territory 125 miles wide from an altitude of 70,000 feet. With enough resolution to identify individual aircraft on the ground, count the number of missiles at a launch site, or read the markings on a railroad car. In a single overflight mission, the U-2 could photograph 1,200 miles of Soviet territory. Johnson's team built the first U-2 in 8 months, under budget, in complete secrecy. The aircraft first flew in August 1955 at a secret facility in the Nevada desert known internally as the Ranch. Decades later, the site would become famous worldwide under another name, Area 51. The U-2 program was given the code name Aquatone, later changed to Chalice, and finally to Overflight. Publicly, it didn't exist. When the CIA needed a cover story for the aircraft, they told the world it was a high-altitude weather research plane operated by NASA. The aircraft was painted in NASA colors. The pilots were given civilian cover identities. On paper, they were NASA research contractors studying atmospheric conditions. The first operational overflight of the Soviet Union took place on July 4, 1956, American Independence Day. The symbolism was not accidental. The pilot flew from a base in West Germany, crossed into Soviet airspace, and photographed military installations at Leningrad, the naval base at Kronstadt, and a bomber airfield at Minsk. The photographs were extraordinary, sharper, more detailed, and more comprehensive than anything American intelligence had ever obtained. President Eisenhower was shown the results within days. He could identify individual aircraft on Soviet airfields. He could count the bombers. He could see the missile facilities. For the first time, American intelligence had hard evidence of what the Soviets were actually building, rather than what they feared they might be building. Over the next 4 years, the U-2 flew dozens of missions over Soviet territory. The Soviets tracked every single one. From the very first flight, Soviet radar stations detected the U-2 entering their airspace. Fighter pilots were scrambled to intercept. They climbed as high as their aircraft could go and fell short every time. The U-2 was simply out of reach. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was furious. He knew exactly what the Americans were doing, but he couldn't stop it, and he couldn't publicly admit it, because admitting that American spy planes were flying freely over his country would be an enormous embarrassment. So the Soviets said nothing, and the Americans kept flying. But the Soviets were working on the problem. Their engineers were developing a new surface-to-air missile system, the SA-2 guideline, a missile designed specifically to reach altitudes that Soviet fighters could not, capable of reaching 70,000 feet and above. By 1960, they were ready. They were waiting for their chance. France's Gary Powers was 30 years old in May 1960. He was a former Air Force fighter pilot from Virginia who had been recruited by the CIA in 1956. He was calm, methodical, and experienced. He had flown U-2 missions before, including overflights of the Soviet Union. On May 1st, 1960, he took off from Peshawar Air Station in Pakistan in a U-2 designated Article 360. His mission: fly across the entire width of the Soviet Union, photographing military targets along the way, and land at Bodo Airfield in Norway. The route would take him over Sverdlovsk, deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, over 1,000 miles inside Soviet territory. For the first 90 minutes, everything went as planned. Then, somewhere over Sverdlovsk, at an altitude of approximately 70,500 feet, an SA-2 missile battery locked onto his aircraft. What happened next is still debated by historians. The official Soviet account, and the version most historians accept today, is that one of several SA-2 missiles launched that morning detonated near the U-2, damaging the aircraft and causing it to break apart at altitude. Some details remain disputed. Different accounts have emerged over the decades, and historians still debate exactly how the aircraft was brought down. But there is no dispute about the outcome. The U-2 had finally been defeated. Powers managed to exit the stricken aircraft, whether by ejection or by climbing out manually is unclear, and parachuted to Earth. He landed in a field near Sverdlovsk. Soviet farmers found him within minutes. He was alive. He was in Soviet territory. He was in his CIA pressure suit with his CIA equipment, including a partially developed film roll, maps of Soviet military installations, and a CIA identity document. And his aircraft, most of it, was on the ground around him. The SA-2 had worked. Back in Washington, the CIA and the White House waited for news. When Powers failed to arrive in Norway and failed to make radio contact, they activated their cover story. NASA released a statement saying that one of their high-altitude weather research aircraft had gone missing after the pilot reported oxygen difficulties over Turkey. The aircraft may have accidentally crossed into Soviet airspace. It was a weather plane, unarmed, peaceful, civilian. It was a calculated gamble. If the aircraft had been destroyed at altitude, as the CIA expected, the wreckage would be unidentifiable. Powers, they assumed, was dead. The cover story would hold. They were wrong on both counts. Khrushchev waited. He had the pilot. He had the wreckage. He had the cameras, the film, and the spy equipment. He let the Americans repeat their cover story publicly. And then, on May 7th, he stood before the Supreme Soviet and revealed everything. He produced photographs of the U-2 wreckage. He displayed the spy equipment. He announced that the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was alive in Soviet custody and had confessed to being a CIA spy. The Americans had been caught in a direct, provable lie. Eisenhower was left with no choice but to admit that the United States had been conducting deliberate espionage flights over Soviet territory for years. It was one of the most humiliating moments in the history of American foreign policy. The timing could not have been worse. Just 11 days after Powers was shot down, the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France were scheduled to meet in Paris for a summit conference, one of the most significant diplomatic meetings of the Cold War era. Eisenhower and Khrushchev had been carefully building toward this moment for months. There was genuine hope that the summit might reduce tensions and begin a path toward arms reduction. The U-2 incident destroyed it. Khrushchev arrived in Paris and immediately demanded that Eisenhower personally apologize for the spy flights, punish those responsible, and guarantee that such flights would never happen again. Eisenhower refused to apologize. Khrushchev walked out of the summit. For years of careful diplomacy gone, in an afternoon, back in Moscow, Francis Gary Powers was put on trial. The trial was a spectacle, carefully staged for maximum propaganda value. Powers sat in a Soviet courtroom in August 1960, facing charges of espionage. The proceedings were broadcast around the world. Powers admitted his role in the mission and cooperated with the proceedings, though the trial itself was widely viewed in the West as a carefully managed political event. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years, 3 years in prison, followed by 7 years of hard labor. He served less than 2. On February 10, 1962, on a gray winter morning on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the bridge that divided East from West, that divided the free world from the Soviet bloc. Francis Gary Powers walked toward freedom. Coming the other way was Rudolf Abel, a senior KGB intelligence officer who had been arrested in New York in 1957 and convicted of espionage against the United States. Both men crossed the bridge. Both men went home. It was the first major spy exchange of the Cold War, a quiet, choreographed transaction on a fog-covered bridge that became one of the defining images of the era. Powers returned to the United States to a complicated reception. Some called him a hero. Others questioned why he had not destroyed his aircraft or used the suicide pin, a poison-tipped pin that CIA pilots were given for use if captured. Powers insisted he had never been ordered to use it and had chosen to survive. He spent years rebuilding his reputation. He became a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station, reporting on traffic. On August 1st, 1977, his helicopter ran out of fuel and crashed. Francis Gary Powers was killed. He was 47 years old. In 2012, 35 years after his death, the United States government awarded him the Silver Star, the Prisoner of War Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal. It was an acknowledgement, long overdue, that he had served his country with courage. The U-2 incident changed everything. It ended the era of manned overflights of the Soviet Union. After Powers was shot down, Eisenhower suspended the U-2 program over Soviet territory. It never resumed. The Americans turned to satellites instead. And within 2 years, the Corona reconnaissance satellite program was producing imagery that surpassed anything the U-2 had gathered. But the U-2 itself never stopped flying. Remarkably, 60 years after it first entered service, the Lockheed U-2 is still operational with the United States Air Force today. It has been used over Cuba, China, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of other conflict zones. It has outlasted every aircraft designed to replace it, and its legacy extends further than most people realize. The photographs taken by U-2 flights over the Soviet Union in the late 1950s fundamentally changed American defense policy. They revealed that the so-called bomber gap, the fear that the Soviets had far more long-range bombers than the Americans, was a myth. The Soviets had fewer bombers than American intelligence had estimated, not more. At the time, many American politicians and military planners believed the Soviet Union possessed a vast fleet of long-range strategic bombers capable of threatening the United States. The U-2 photographs revealed that much of this fear had been based on incomplete information and worst-case assumptions rather than reality. The U-2 photographs prevented a massive, unnecessary expansion of American bomber production. They saved billions of dollars, and they gave American policymakers accurate information to work with, rather than fear and speculation. In one of history's great ironies, the spy plane that helped trigger one of the Cold War's most serious diplomatic crises may also have been one of its most important intelligence tools. By showing American leaders what the Soviets actually had, rather than what they feared they might have, it reduced uncertainty, improved strategic decision-making, and helped prevent costly mistakes driven by fear and speculation. And then there is Francis Gary Powers. For decades, his name was associated with failure, with being shot down, captured, and put on trial. The man who blew the cover story, the man who didn't use the suicide pin. The full picture is more complicated. He was a skilled pilot who survived the unsurvivable, endured a Soviet prison, and returned home with his integrity intact. He never broke under interrogation. He never revealed operational details that would have compromised his colleagues. He was, by any honest measure, a remarkable man. The bridge in Berlin, where he was exchanged, still stands. They call it the Bridge of Spies. The U-2 spy plane was supposed to be invisible. It flew so high that human eyes couldn't see it, and for 4 years, Soviet missiles couldn't reach it. It photographed the most heavily defended territory on Earth and brought the images home safely, mission after mission. And then, on a May morning over Sverdlovsk, a single missile changed everything. What followed, the cover-up, the exposure, the failed summit, the trial, the exchange on a bridge in Berlin, became one of the defining stories of the 20th century. A story about the limits of secrecy, the cost of espionage, and the strange, dangerous world that the Cold War created. The U-2 is still flying today, still gathering intelligence, still operating at the edge of what is physically possible for a manned aircraft. Some stories don't end, they just keep flying. If you'd like to support this project, the link is in the description below. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We'll see you on the next flight.